Let's start on borders. Your new research today shows that the UK was one of only a handful of countries, one of only 4 or 5 out of a total of 185 in April and May last year, not to have any international travel restrictions in place, which is a reasonably surprising statistic. In your view, what should the UK government have done and when? And crucially, would that have saved lives?
Well, look, firstly, I think it's absolutely right to say that the government has been too slow in terms of action at the border and that they were an international outlier in that respect. As you mentioned in your question, Tom, in May 2020, it was only the UK, Iran, Luxembourg, and the US Virgin Islands with no travel controls in place. The quarantine system eventually came in June. I happen to believe it isn't working effectively at the moment, but my view is that that sort of system should have been introduced at a far earlier stage last year. If you look at the period between the 1st of January and the 23rd of March, which was the date of the first lockdown, only 273 people were formally quarantined from 4 flights in that period. And that's a period, incidentally, when the government's chief scientific advisor was saying that the virus was being seeded in the UK from across Europe. And there's no doubt at all that failure to act has been extraordinarily costly. The slowness continues. The government is now meeting earlier this week. They need a comprehensive system of protection at the borders, not moving from one chaotic situation to another.
So we know that the government is discussing what to do and how to tighten up their borders. Matt Hancock just confirmed that to us. The idea of hotel quarantining to protect against the new variant is being actively discussed. I think we'll hear an announcement about that this coming week. Tell me where Labour is on this. Do you support forced quarantining in hotels for everyone coming into the UK, or is it just certain groups from certain high-risk countries?
Well, clearly there is going to be an exception, should be an exception for example, hauliers, lorry drivers going across the English Channel. That's always been a particular issue, and you need particular measures in place to keep those supplies moving. However, I am in favour of a comprehensive system across travellers who come into the United Kingdom with regard to hotel quarantining. But as I've said, Tom, so often throughout this, time and time again to the government, yes, I will support the bringing of the hotel quarantining, but we have to now have that plan for the future and that comprehensive system. We can't have this waiting until June last year to have a quarantining system at all,
Sure.
then it being ineffective. And between June and September of last year, the government's own figures show that there were about 2 million people who were spot checked for their passenger locator forms for their details at the border. Only about 3% of them were actually positively contacted to check they were quarantined. Now, that simply isn't good enough.
Looking forward, because that's what we want to talk about now, I want to know where you are. What do you want the government to do? When you say a comprehensive system, should that mean every passenger, apart from hauliers, coming into the UK, or just foreign nationals? And crucially, if they're staying in hotels, who should pay the bills?
Right. Well, first of all, I do think it should be comprehensive. You'll appreciate I don't have the data in front of me,
But can you
if the
define
government does it on a more restricted basis, there'd have to be very good reasons for it. So I think it needs to be comprehensive.
What does that mean?
Secondly, right across the board. Secondly, I then think that, yes, it would need, if you look at the system, how it's worked in other countries, it has worked around travellers paying for it for themselves. But you then have to make sure as well that you have a system in place, you have the checks in place to ensure that people are actually adhering to it, because that's been the problem throughout. We've moved through different things and different policies. If this is going to be the policy, let it be comprehensive, let it be enforceable.
Okay, I'm still not sure what you mean by comprehensive. Feel free to define exactly who you mean you'd like to quarantine. If you don't want to, then let me put this to you. One MP said to me this week, we're not actually in a lockdown, we're in a semi-lockdown. The only country in the world that actually did a full-blown lockdown is China, restricted everything. Now, we know the new variant is more deadly as well as more transmissible now. Should the lockdown, in your view, be tighter?
Well, look, we called for a lockdown, and I'm pleased that the government did then listen and put that lockdown into place in England. Of course, it came into force earlier here, where I'm speaking to you from in Wales. Yes, there could be more that could be done. From our previous discussion, clearly there's much more to be done around the borders. I also think there's a lot more to be done around messaging. I'll just give you one example. We had all that messaging last year trying to push people back into the office. I'm speaking to you from Wales today. We're in a government agency, the DVLA in Swansea, we've got a huge outbreak of COVID-19 with a lot of questions to be asked about safety at the workplace and whether people actually needed to be in the office. So I think there is much more we can do, much more that the government can do to match, if I may say so, the extraordinary sacrifice of the British people who have been sacrificing in their daily lives throughout the pandemic.
That case of DVLA really is quite extraordinary. But let's talk a bit about enforcement, because that has been an issue this week. We've seen some tightening of fines, higher fines imposed by the government. But non-compliance is still an issue, still too high. I'm sure you'd agree with that. Should the police have extra powers then? The government stopped short, in particular, of giving them power of entry to break up a lot of these parties. Would you like to see the police given special powers of entry while the pandemic lasts?
Well, my approach on this has always been to support the action that our frontline officers take in very difficult circumstances. And on the issue of powers, I speak on a weekly basis to representatives of police officers, all the different ranks of officers, and I always discuss that issue of whether they need more powers or not. And if they made a particular request, then obviously I think the right thing to do would be to consider that, of course. I do support and have made clear my support for the principle of additional fines with regard to house parties, but I also think it should be pointed out that non-compliance, when it's flagrant non-compliance, repeated non-compliance, of course we need enforcement, absolutely, and I back the police in doing that. But at the same time, I also think the overall police approach has been about right. They've pursued, of course, this 4Es approach of explaining, engaging, and encouraging before they get to enforcement. And I think that our frontline officers have done an extremely good job throughout sticking to that.
Okay, so perhaps no fresh powers then. What about this idea? We're speaking this morning to a senior Israeli doctor in the Israeli Health Ministry, Dr. Asher Salmon, who tells us when people are isolating, police regularly go to their houses, a lot of them, and get them to shout out of their windows to prove they are actually in their houses and isolating. Would you like to see British police doing that here?
No, I think we've got to be realistic about what we expect our police officers to do. And I think that our police officers have already been asked to do a quite extraordinary amount and are doing it to the very best of their ability. I think there are other issues around self-isolation, particularly in terms of filling gaps in financial support that exist. I think, for example, of self-employed people who are in a very different position to those who are salaried. So the emphasis, I think, on getting people to self-isolate must be around the support that's available rather than looking immediately to the police for answers, I think.
Okay, since we've got you, let me put a couple of things to you that's around from various Labour colleagues of yours this morning. First of all, if Donald Trump is convicted by the Senate, his impeachment trial begins next week, as you know. If he's convicted of insurrection, should the UK government recognise the severity of those crimes and ban him from entering the UK? That's the suggestion from Graham Morris this morning, a senior Labour MP, former Shadow Cabinet Minister.
Well, look, I think that these are decisions that have to be made on the facts further down the line. I mean, what I see at the moment is an American president who has just come into office. I think his coming into office represents and it is a symbol of closing a divide that has existed in American politics and existed in politics around the world. And I think at the moment, it is good to see an American president both putting into measures things in domestic law about, around workers' rights, but also to see America engaging with the wider world, back, of course, the ties of the World Health Organization, Paris Climate Change Accord. So I think that has to be the focus at the moment, and working with the new president of the United States, which I think is a moment of hope for the world.
Very interesting thoughts on Joe Biden, which many would share. You didn't answer my question about Donald Trump, though, because this is a decision the government will imminently have to take. It does sound like you're not particularly bothered of him to come over to Scotland and have a round of golf after he's impeached.
Well, look, the point I'm making to you, though, is that is something that the government will have to deal with in the circumstances of the time, looking obviously at how that trial has operated and what the president's convicted of. But let me just say this. I utterly condemn those scenes on Capitol Hill, which I thought were absolutely appalling. We always stand with the American people and their elected representatives, and now is the moment to build that relationship, renew our special relationship with President Biden, which I do think will be a very positive relationship for this country.
Okay, and finally, Lisa Nandy, your shadow cabinet colleague, shadow foreign secretary, is copping a bit of flack this morning for praising a report that calls for the army to be renamed Peace Force. Do you agree with that idea?
No, and neither does Lisa Nandy. She's made absolutely clear that that is absolute nonsense. I understand that that fact was highlighted to the journalist prior to the publication of the story. Labour is a passionate supporter of our armed forces and indeed their families, and will continue to argue for support for our armed forces and indeed our veterans as well.
Okay, I mean, Lisa Nandy did actually say she was inspired by that report. That was a direct quote from her, unless that's been denied as well. But just to be clear, there is nothing wrong with it being called the armed forces. It shouldn't be known as the human security services.
No, it is the armed forces, and Lisa Nandy herself has made clear what absolute nonsense this is. I'm very proud of our armed forces. I work with numerous armed forces groups in my own constituency, as do other Labour MPs. We recognise the tremendous service of our troops to our country. We fully support them in what they do. And as I've also said, we will argue for the best possible support for their families and for veterans too.
Okay, one thing I don't think Lisa Nandy has denied, though, is her somewhat controversial, interesting description of Joe Biden as a woke man. Are you a woke man, and is Keir Starmer a woke man?
Well, listen, I'm talking to you from my constituency, and I was inspired to come into politics in the late 80s and early 1990s by Margaret Thatcher's devastation of communities here and putting people to one side who had extraordinary talents. I came into politics so people could make the most of their talents, for a more equal society, to tackle injustice, and for an outward-looking Britain that is projecting those views around the world, speaking up for poverty, speaking up for rights, speaking up for those values. Whatever that makes me, I'm quite happy for any label to be attached to it.
I can attach woke. Sounds like you're happy with that.
You can feel free to attach what you want. I know what I believe in and what I came into politics to do. Whatever label is attached to it by others is a matter for them.
It's Lisa Nandy's attachment rather than mine. Anyway, Nick Thomas-Symonds, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.